And so far they also haven't spent as much as they promised they would spend, so there are even capacity constraints along these lines. Going back to your project, you start with 1989. That's an important decision, right? That is one of those things that historians do, right? We try to subdivide the time. Why 1989? What's the significance of that year?
So the book, if you like, in the title is Europe since 1989. The working title is On the Brink, Europe since 1989. The book itself is made up of 3 parts. The first part is what I call the long 1989. The second part is called Europe Recast, and then the third part is called On the Brink. But the first part, the long 1989, so I think the year 1989 itself is, of course, of considerable historical significance for a specific number of reasons.
And here, right, like we are talking in Prague, in the Czech Republic, the Velvet Revolution of 1989.
Exactly. And one of the features about 1989 is that, to be honest, if you go back to what was Czechoslovakia at the time in, say, March 1989, even going into the summer of 1989, you would not have expected any of the changes which then took place in an incredibly accelerated fashion in the autumn of 1989.
I remember Václav Havel was interviewed for a German magazine, the Spiegel magazine, in the summer of 1989, when things were happening in Poland and Hungary, and he said, no, Czechoslovakia is different, people are apathetic, cynical, nothing is going to happen. So absolutely, yeah.
So on the one hand, it's very condensed and very short, okay, and an accelerated kind of historical moment. But on the other hand, I think what I'm trying to do with this notion of the long 1989 is to decenter 1989 away from a specific set of events, which was the collapse of single-party rule across Central and Eastern Europe and the introduction of multi-party elections. That is really what happened.
Single-party rule meaning the communist system of power, basically.
That's right, yeah, the National Communist
monopoly,
parties, backed militarily by the Soviet Union, in power, and the transition away from that to multi-party elections. Okay? Now that was... in some places it didn't happen in 1989. In Albania this took longer. In Romania what happened was a sort of more superficial change, and then events continued afterwards. But the long 1999 for me refers to a broader process of historical change, which is as much relevant for thinking about the evolution of Western European societies as it is Central and Eastern European societies. It's a transformation where the particular kind of state and society model that had been built up after the Second World War started to be disassembled and disappeared. And that process of change, I sort of date it from, there are a few kind of significant moments. One is in Italy in 1984, 1985. You had quite a fundamental change in the Italian political economic system. There was a referendum around wage indexation that really hit hard at the power of unions and at the power of the National Communist Party, and began, I think, to unravel the Italian state political and social model. And that process, I think, takes a long time in Western Europe, and in Central and Eastern Europe you have this broader process of change. And by the time we get to the mid-1990s, however, we have a certain homogeneity across different European societies, which is to say the political system, the parties have become a bit cut off from society. They're now sort of the parties that we know them to be today. The model of a market economy has been adopted. There's a certain homogeneity which then lays the basis for a profound recasting of Europe, and that's then the next stage. But so 1989 for me is a critical year sitting within a broader historical conjunction.
You also distinguish between the kind of openness of that 1989 represented, right? That there were paths not taken. Would you explain what could have been? This is one of those questions that historians dislike, but we are political scientists, right? We are interested in studying continuity and change. What could have been in the 1990s in this region, in Central and Eastern Europe, and in the relationship between the West and the East?
So I think the principal difference seems to me to be really about the nature of the European security architecture. And that presupposes many things, not least the question of what role should the United States play in European security. When we get towards the sort of winding up of the Cold War, I think that is a question that's very central amongst the minds of a lot of American policymakers. Don't necessarily take it for granted that things will continue, and so they wonder what will replace.
That's right, because in their view, the collapse of communism basically meant that the US-led West prevailed, right?
Well, it prevailed, but it also took away a justification for the existing architecture.
Yes.
NATO was a product of the Cold War, as much as the Warsaw Pact was a product of the Cold War. It expressed a certain set of attitudes that were quite closely connected to the division of Germany. And so what you have in 1989 and then into 1990 is a shake-up of all of that.
Yes.
Okay? The enemy seems to have gone. The principal sort of dividing line, which was the post-1945 settlement, which was meant to guarantee the absence of a resurgent dominant Germany again, was the division of Germany. That also disappeared. So many things are changing. And what's most curious for me is that looking back, the one thing that didn't change is a central role for the United States within NATO, which became bigger and more powerful rather than having dwindled. And if we go back to the early 1990s, there was a lot of questions about what would we do with NATO. It wasn't self-evident that they would continue, because after all, what was the purpose? Well, why was it there? Something else should replace it. And that something else logically would have been something run by Europeans for themselves, taking charge of their own security, because there's no need for this US involvement anymore. But none of that happened, and that seems to me sort of one of the mysteries of that period.
Now, fast forward to the present, and that's kind of the last question I have. What does the Russian invasion of Ukraine mean to EU's ambition to European security? You know, people like Josep Borrell never stop talking about the need to speak the language of power, but as we discussed at the opening of this conversation, there are some very serious limitations to that ambition. So what does the Russian invasion of Ukraine mean to the EU's ambition to be a genuine security actor?
So my personal view is I think it killed it. I think it was the definitive final nail in the coffin of this 25-year project of
whether you call it European sovereignty or European autonomy and whatnot, right?
Exactly. And which was incarnated in a specific European security and defence policy. I think it killed it because underlying that European ambition for its own security role was a desire to enfranchise itself from a US-dominated order. And that desire was, on the one hand, not shared by all European states at all. So you have a big divide between the more Atlanticist states and the more, if you want to call them Gaullist, or the sort of ones more focused on a European path. That was never agreement, always many divisions. On top of that, in terms of ability, material power, sort of military power, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine made it very clear that the European states were very, very far behind and could only play a supporting role to the US, which was the only real power that mattered in terms of providing arms. And any ambition to be autonomous, to have an alternative to NATO. I mean, we have to remember that a few years before the invasion, French President Emmanuel Macron had declared NATO brain dead.
Yes.
You know, so this view of doing something else, doing our own thing in Europe exists. And I think after the invasion, it became very clear that there was nothing. There was no alternative. There was no alternative vision. There was no alternative mechanism to operate outside of NATO. There was no material capability to do so. So it really was consolidating that existing status quo.